My name is Nicholas Storley, and I want to thank you all for being here this evening. I chose to do this project and organize the speaker event because outdoor recreation is what I have chosen to shape my life around. It's very important to me, and getting people involved in it is also very important to my future and anyone that enjoys recreating in the outdoors, their futures as well. The title tonight of this event is Bridging the Gap, Raising Awareness for Inclusion in the Outdoors. And really the importance of this is what we do now will shape our ability to enjoy our natural spaces in the future. We need to create a sense of inclusion to where everyone values these spaces as much as I know some of us here do tonight. We're very fortunate to be able to hear from Aparna Rajagopal Durbin, who is a founding partner of the Avarna Club and has done work for many years with different outdoor organizations and environmental organizations to create a culture of inclusion and diversity in the outdoors and in recreation. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Aparna.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're not a club or a group.
I'm sorry. I've been
No, that's funny because the Sierra Clubs, we've been talking to a lot of organizations like the Appalachian Mountain Club and the Sierra Club, and they started as clubs, and clubs inherently are exclusionary because either you're in or you're out. So yeah, we're the Avarna group. Hi, everyone. I know this is like not the ideal setting to interact, especially given your majors, and you'd probably rather be outside on this beautiful day. And frankly, I would too. But I'm also excited to be here with you all. Yeah, I'm the founding partner of the Avarna Group. My background is, I also really forged a pretty transformative connection with wild and remote outdoor spaces when I was really young, because my parents are Indian immigrants, and the way that they decided that we would be more American, and this was back in the 80s, so I might be like dating myself a little bit here, is we would all pack up as an extended family of like 30 people who lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we would take a couple of campers that we'd rent and station wagons, and we'd head to a national park. And we would head to whatever national park had like 3 adjacent group campsites, because we were that big of a group. And I really fell in love with it. And, so my really formative connection with the outdoors was, at least for me, wasn't about the sort of like wild John Muir style escape, but my connection with the outdoors was through community and through family. And so it took, but I ended up pursuing a really traditional career path. I was an engineer, and then I was a lawyer, and I did environmental law, but I always loved the outdoors and kept going back to it, and started rock climbing and running, and decided I was just done being a weekend warrior after about 10 years of practicing law. And I left California, and I moved here. I'm sitting here in Lander, Wyoming, which is also the headquarters of the National Outdoor Leadership School. And that's where I landed in 2010. I became their diversity and inclusion manager, and as well as a field instructor for NOLS, and did that for 6 years, and decided that I really loved the diversity and inclusion work, and I wanted to pop out of the outdoor ed box and do this work with like a broader range of organizations that have a touch point with the outdoors, not just outdoor ed, but the outdoor industry. So the for-profit outdoor industry, youth development, camps, environmental advocacy organizations, conservation corps organizations, land management agencies. And so I joined forces with my partner, Ava, who is not here. And we launched the Avarna Group. And so since then, we've had really the privilege of being able to work with about 60 different organizations and institutions and agencies. Most of them are like the .edus and .orgs and .govs. So like, we're not in it for the money. But we do work with a couple of for-profit, couple of brands, like outdoor industry brands. and they're the ones that are the most squeamish about me telling you who they are, which is funny. So that's what we do. We're not just two; we're a group of people who live all over the country. We're growing really fast, and we are really excited to support all these organizations that have a touch point with the outdoors in furthering equity and inclusion, and then ultimately diversity. So that's me. I'm going to try to make this as interactive as possible. I do webinars. Like, this is like my mode all day. I'm on webcam, as you might imagine. I don't have a lot of work in Lander, so I try to make it interactive, just so you know. So there'll be like times during this next hour and a half that I ask you all to sort of think about things, or like pair and share, and then like share out. So I'll try to make it as interactive as possible, because I'm also an outdoor educator, and I know how hard it is to sit and stare at a big talking head or little talking head on a screen. So anyway, any questions before I launch into this PowerPoint? Crickets. I hear crickets. I'm going to keep going. Okay, so this title is raising awareness for inclusion in the outdoors. And so my question is, there are a bunch of words that get sort of bandied about in this space. So when I started this work, it was diversity work, and then it was diversity and inclusion work, and then it was diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And if you're the Sierra Club, you just toss out the diversity and the inclusion and call it equity and justice work. And then if you're the National Park Service, you call it cultural relevancy work. So all these words get sort of mixed around and used interchangeably and used in like very imprecise ways. And I always say that ambiguity does a disservice to all of us. So I wanted to just like get on the same page about at least what we as the Avarna group believe what these words mean. So at least we like are all speaking the same language for the rest of the time we have together. So I'll just like ask, and you can all just like shout it out popcorn style. When I say diversity, what do you all think of? Word association. Don't think too hard. And I maybe can't hear like folks in the back. So if you want to, Nick, if you want to repeat what people say, that would be great.
I can definitely do that.
Okay, so diversity. What do you think of?
Melting pot.
Melting pot. Okay.
Multiple cultures represented in a group.
Okay.
Different life experiences.
Okay.
I would say sharing experiences.
Okay. Anything else? What about when I say inclusion? What do you think of when I say inclusion, which is in the title of this event?
Equality, adaptability, at times through history, inequality.
Mm-hmm.
I would say a welcoming culture.
Cool. Okay, so let's like hang on to that collection of words and we'll revisit them. Actually, let me just ask you now. So when I asked you what diversity was, there was like, well, now I should have written all this down. Dang it. So you melting pot, different experiences and cultures, and then when I said inclusion, it was about welcoming. What is like the difference in like the words you all thought of for diversity versus the words you all thought of for inclusion? If you're thinking about like, I mean, you can like go all the way back to grammar class, like sixth grade or wherever, whenever we learned about it. Like what's the difference in those words that you came up with for diversity versus inclusion?
For diversity, we talked about things being different, and for inclusion, we talked about things being the same.
Okay, that's interesting. Cool. Okay. Anything else? Any other differences in the words?
I kind of agree with that sentiment. Diversity, to me, doesn't represent a culture or an environment. It represents more of a demographic, and inclusion encompasses more of a culture and a feeling that goes along with diversity.
Okay.
Inclusion is an act and diversity is a characteristic.
Cool. Okay. That's great. Yeah. So yeah, I think diversity is more, and people just called this diversity work for so long, but diversity is that sort of characteristic or differences within a group, and diversity is pretty static. It doesn't really involve anything. Inclusion is the actual action-oriented stuff that you do to sort of welcome that diversity. But I want to go beyond that and actually show you some definitions. And this PowerPoint is yours. So like if I'm hoping you're not like vigorously taking notes at 6 p.m. I will send this to you if you want it. So the way we define diversity is the differences between us based on which we experience advantages or encounter barriers to opportunities and resources. So for like biologists, let's say like the most literal definition of diversity would be like the unique differences between individuals in a group. And some of you talked about like different experiences when I asked what, like what comes up for you when I say diversity. But we actually made this definition is a little bit different. So if you like go to corporate America or law firms where I used to work, diversity is like every single difference between us in a group. Like we all have different styles and we all have different interests and we all have different ways of being and we all have different backgrounds and we need to honor that. And yes, and it's yes. And in the work that we do at the Avarna Group, we have to think about power dynamics. And it's not just every difference between us, right? Just because I have an innie belly button and someone else has an outie belly button doesn't mean like my innie people don't have disproportionately high incarceration rates and different access to healthcare and like lower graduation rates. It's those differences where there's systems that either create barriers or create advantage. And so it is all those differences that we typically think of. Race and ethnicity is like the first thing people think of. It's also about gender identity. It's also about sexual orientation. It's also about class. Class is really important to think about in Colorado. It's also about ability and age and all these different identities that we hold based on which we either have advantages, systemic advantages, or experience barriers. So that's our definition of diversity. And a couple of notes on diversity is that an individual person is not diverse. So one of my huge pet peeves is like being called diverse or being told like we need a diverse candidate or a diverse faculty member or a diverse student. But, grammatically it doesn't work because diversity describes a whole group of people. But I think what happens is people use the word diverse as code because it's so much more comfortable to say a diverse person than to be more specific and say, we need a person of color. We need someone who identifies as queer. We need someone who is like low income or like living low income in an urban community. It's just so much more uncomfortable. And so people just say diverse. And so I think the first real big take home I would say, as we're talking about these definitions, is that just be more precise. And if you're thinking about the lack of diversity, let's say in your program, you can say like, oh, there aren't a lot of people of color in our program, or there are not a lot of people who grew up in like low income households in our program, instead of like we're not diverse, and because usually that is just code for race. And then, as I just mentioned, diversity isn't just about race. I think it's really important to talk about race and ethnicity, specifically in outdoor recreation, because there's a unique history to it that has like systemically excluded people who are like Indigenous, Native American, and people of color. It's really important to talk about race. It's also important to talk about the fact that we all hold tons of other identities that are marginalized, whether it's sexual orientation or ability or class. So that's how we define diversity. I'm going to keep chugging here on definitions so that we can get sort of the meat of the presentation. But inclusion is this idea. We used to define inclusion as just celebrating and welcoming all difference, creating a welcoming environment for all difference. And I think that in outdoor recreation, if you're leading trips, let's say, it's your responsibility to be able to create a culture on your program where you're celebrating and valuing all the differences. And it creates a few barriers if you just define inclusion that way. So we have a different definition here, and I'll explain why. It's celebrating, valuing, and amplifying voices, perspective, styles, and values and identities that have been marginalized. And the reason we define it this way is that a couple of reasons. Like, first of all, if you think of inclusion as like including everybody in all these different ways that people show up in all these different identities and all these different values, then you may be stuck with like that one person, that one like program participant who says, actually, like, I want to participate in this program, but I will not sleep in a tent with someone who is gay because that's against my religion or whatever. And I think that that's really a hard question to answer if you define inclusion as, or that's a hard issue to tackle if you define inclusion as welcoming all difference, because you might be like really compelled to be like, how do I include this person? If you define inclusion as celebrating, valuing, and amplifying those ways that have been marginalized, then you can pretty easily say, like, guess what? You know, in our program, inclusion is really about thinking about who has been systemically marginalized historically and currently, and the LGBTQ community has. And so if you're not wanting to participate in a program where you might have to sleep in a tent next to someone who's gay, maybe this is not the place for you. So that's one reason why we define inclusion this way. The other reason why we define inclusion this way, and this is like I'm gonna get all mathy on you here, is that so there's like a bell. If you think of a bell curve, I don't know how to do it with my fingers, but a bell curve. And you think of the top of the bell curve, or like the peak, is like all the different ways, identities, and leadership styles, and communication styles, and risk management styles, or whatever that you reward. Whether it's in your program or whether it's going to eventually be on like the programs you lead, if you are going to celebrate and value everything on that bell curve, and the people in the margins are like the people who are not rewarded. If you're going to just value everyone, you're just going to move that whole bell curve up, which means there's still going to be people in the margins. And so with this definition of inclusion, you're not focusing on like the peak, you're focusing on the margins, and you're saying like, why is it that there are people on the margins? Why is it that particular people or particular styles or particular values or particular connections with nature are not valued in the outdoor recreation space? And let's focus on that, because guess what? At the end of the day, the people like who are already rewarded are going to be continue to be rewarded. And so that's how we define inclusion. And I think it's really helped organizations focus their efforts in a very particular and very precise way in those margins, whether it's like people who are, thinking about communities of color or low-income communities or LGBTQ communities. So that's how we define diversity and inclusion. A couple of really quick things is that this Peace Corps uses this thing called the continuum of social relationships. Let me just ask you, actually, I'm not going to show it to you. I'm going to turn it off for a second. Sometimes people think of inclusion and tolerance as the same thing. Has anyone here been in a tolerant environment, and what does that feel like? And Nick, you're going to have to yell it into the mic.
I would say an environment where you feel like you can share things and not be judged for them.
So that's how you think of tolerance? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Great. Anyone else? Like, have you been in an environment where you're like, it's been tolerant or you've been tolerated? Like, what does that feel like?
Comfortable. Western seems tolerant to someone of Connor's demographic.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're just putting up with something and not actually dealing with it.
Yeah. So like, did you hear like how different those answers were? Because I think for some people, tolerance feels like a good thing. It came out of the civil rights movement, aspiring toward tolerance. And for other people, tolerance just feels like you're being put up with. And it never really feels good to be tolerated, because it doesn't really feel like people see you. They're just like, all right, you're all right. I guess you can be part of this. So the reason I wanted to show this is the Peace Corps uses this. This is a continuum of social relationships among human groups. And the Peace Corps, obviously, they operate in countries where there's genocide, which is all the way on the left, and then playfulness all the way on the right. And if you look at where tolerance is, it's kind of in the middle, which is putting up with others. But inclusion, so creating an inclusive environment, is toward the right, which is actively welcoming other people. And that's the whole point of this. We don't have to spend a ton of time reading this, and it's yours if you want to cogitate over it later. But inclusion and tolerance are two different things, and us as well as accommodation. So when you say we need to accommodate that, it also sort of has the same sort of feeling as tolerance, because it's we have our culture. This person's weird and different, and in order for them to be part of this culture, we need to either tolerate or accommodate them. So oftentimes we say how do you change that? What are some words you could use that are different? And some words could be how do we honor that, or how do we value that? How do we affirm your values in this particular program culture, instead of how do we accommodate your needs, which never really feels good. So that's inclusion. Inclusion's also not this idea of overcoming difference. So oftentimes people think of diversity as very divisive, and they're we don't want to talk about diversity. Here's the little activity from the Teaching Tolerance website. Teaching diversity, we're all the same on the inside. The reality is that we are not all the same on the inside, first of all. And secondly, if you think about diversity as this bad thing that you don't want to talk about or is divisive, and if you want to just focus on, and it's really tempting in outdoor rec to think about, oh, we're all going through this common epic experience and wearing the same clothing and carrying the same backpacks and eating the same food. So why talk about difference? And it usually comes from a really good place. But the reality is that all of us have very particular identities, and we don't leave that at the door when we enter into the wilderness or enter into an outdoor program. And so what makes me is really important. I don't want you to be hey, Aparna, I know you're a woman and a person of color, but let's not talk about that. We're all human, and we're all doing this peak ascent together. That's awesome, right? For me, that feels like it minimizes pieces of me that are really important. And so we think of inclusion as not as valuing and celebrating difference, and not ignoring or transcending or overcoming difference. And so I have a little, let's see if this animates. Ghostbusters sign on this one is this is not how we want to talk about inclusion. Everyone still with me? Yeah. Okay, couple of other things, because you all mentioned equality. Equity is really important. It's a word that we lead with at the Avarna Group. And so I can't really define equity without defining equality and justice. And so we have this image here of three people who want to watch a baseball game. And on the left panel, you give them all the same box, right? You treat them equally, the golden rule. Treat everyone how you want to be treated, give them all the same thing. And the reality is that they don't all still get to watch that game. There's still this barrier, this systemic barrier in front of them. Equity is an approach. It's a little bit different, because it doesn't mean you treat everyone the same. Equity means that you inherently recognize that everyone doesn't start from the same place, and it's based in fairness. And so you take those same three boxes and redistribute them, and then everyone gets to watch the baseball game. And then finally, justice on the right is when people are thinking about equity first. Eventually, this is our end game, right? The way I work myself out of a job is that those barriers, those fences, whether it's racism or whatever ism, gets torn down, and then we don't need boxes anymore. But that's utopia, right? A little bit. So I wanted to define equity, which is an approach, and it's based on fairness, and to ensuring everyone has equal access to the same opportunities. And that could be access to public lands, access to outdoor programming and leadership education, access to your university, for example. Equity recognizes that advantages and barriers exist, and it's not the same as equality. So if you've heard of the platinum rule, which is treat everyone how they want to be treated, that's more equity. Whereas equality is treat everyone how you want to be treated, which would mean be the same thing with everybody. And so that's equity. And we're almost done with vocab. I just wanted, because you all are entering into the space where a lot of these words are being used, I just want to make sure that you know kind of how we think of them. Cultural competency is another one. So sometimes people think of cultural competency as knowing all of the things about a particular program participant in their community. But we define it as your ability to interact across difference, to flex with difference. And so sure, knowing about cultural norms is one thing, right? Having like the cultural literacy to understand where your colleagues are coming from or where your participants are coming from. But cultural competence isn't the same as just knowing about cultural norms. It's that ability. It's also about self-awareness, knowing how you show up, knowing your identities, knowing how you might impact other people. So, for example, if you were going to India, where my family is from, and you said like, "Hey, Aparna, I'm going to India. I'm going to hang out with your grandma." I don't know why you'd want to do that, but what are all the things I should do? Like, what should I wear? Like, what hand should I use to greet her? How should I speak to her? I can give you all that information, and like maybe my grandma would be psyched, but ultimately, it's not going to make you culturally competent because you really need self-awareness as well. And then this final phrase I want to define is cultural relevancy. And the reason I want to do that is that a lot of state agencies, including like agencies in Colorado and the National Park Service, talk about all of this work as cultural relevancy work, which is what you do and how you do it is relevant to more people and communities. I think cultural relevancy is a lot more palatable for a lot of folks than the words like equity and justice and inclusion. And so I kind of think of it as like an umbrella term for all of this work. Um, and so that's what cultural relevancy is. And so if none of that like took, if you've been asleep at the wheel for the last 20 minutes, that's okay. If words aren't your thing, I just want you to know that they all mean different things. And here's a little mantra we have is that inclusion is what we do. It's action oriented. Equity is how we do it. It's our approach. Cultural competence is what you all need to do it well, right? You need to understand where the other person's coming from and where you're coming from and be able to flex with that. And then ultimately diversity and cultural relevancy are outcomes. Like that's what happens when you're doing the first three things. So that's vocab for the day. And then I'm gonna switch gears now and talk about bias in the outdoor industry. But before I do that, do y'all have any questions?
I don't think we do right now.
Okay, so we're gonna start with this question. Why do you all think this is important? Why are you sitting here in this room on like a beautiful afternoon, evening? I don't know if you get credit for showing up. Maybe that's why you're here. But if you're, that's not the reason, why else? Why else is this important? Why is diversity, equity? Now that we know what it is, why is it important in your future jobs or your current jobs or in your program?
Well, I'll say personally that I know the projection for the year 2044 is that different minorities at this point in the US will outnumber the white majority at this point, who is the typical participant in outdoor recreation, and installing a sense of value for our natural spaces in people that will have a say in legislation in the future is important for protecting the spaces that we care about and work in and enjoy.
Yeah, so you said a couple of things there. The first thing, and this is like maybe the number one reason we always hear is like demographics are changing, which is like legitimate. I think it's important to think about shifting racial and ethnic demographics very specifically in the US and also in Colorado, which is changing really fast. Like the Front Range is changing very, very quickly in terms of racial and ethnic demographics. But it's funny because when we talk, and I work with a lot of like boards and executive directors of nonprofits, and it's like a little bit of like a fear of the brown planet thing of like things are changing and we're going to disappear by 2042 or 2044 or whatever the new date is unless we become more relevant. And I think that that's a really driving reason to do this work. But I would urge you to think about like other reasons beyond the reactive reason of like, oh God, like what happens with these outdoor spaces that we value, and if like we don't we don't introduce more people of color to them, they're not going to care about them, and if they don't care about them, they're not going to vote to protect them, and then they won't be there anymore, and then I can't play there anymore. Um, that I think that's a reason, and maybe there's some other reasons. So I would urge you to think about that too. What are some other reasons that this work could, beyond like it's the right thing to do? What are some other reasons why you think this work could be important? DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion work.
the selflessness of sharing those places with different groups.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, as a practical matter, a lot of these places are public lands and they do belong to everyone. And so the idea of like it's not just for the people who currently have access, it should be for everybody, and everyone should be able to access it. I think that's a really good reason, an important reason. And it's a reason that like a lot of organizations that we support in Colorado are really thinking about, like GOCO, the Great Outdoors Colorado, which is a state agency, is really thinking about access as one of those things that they're trying to tackle. Any other reason?
I think that like the reason why I'm here is because I've got some preconceived notions on why that is, but I don't really know. So it would help me like understand like why certain groups are represented and like how to better bridge that gap so more people can potentially get the positive benefits of like this amazing
Great.
space.
I think I heard you there. And so what you're saying is that for you at least, you don't know why certain people or people with certain identities are not doing the same things you're doing or going to the same places that you're going to, and sort of using that space in the same way. And you're trying to understand that. Is that?
Yeah, you said that's a big part of it.
Yeah. And so yeah, why would it be important? So, and I'm going to get to that, but I'm just curious, like what compels you to want to think about these barriers? Like you're out there, you're getting after it. Like who cares, right? Why are you thinking about barriers to other people? Oh, now I can't hear you anymore. You're gonna have to repeat it.
Because I didn't know about these things until we got here. So it's like there's a lot of people, a lot of groups that just don't know are positive benefits.
So those activities in the outdoors have changed Connor's life, and he just wants to think about that because he was one of the people that didn't necessarily know maybe how to get involved in the outdoors and have the same ideas that he does now.
Yeah. And so it seems like it's like a personal thing for you, Connor, right? For you, at least, the outdoors was like really transformative, and you want to be able to provide that opportunity to other people and also understand like maybe why it doesn't transform other people the way it transformed you. Um, and so, yeah, great. I mean, I just want everyone to be like on the same page. Is like, okay, this is important stuff. The fact that you're in this room leads me to believe that you think it's important. But I think it's really, it is important to talk about why this work is important, because once you end up, for me at least, when I work with different organizations, a lot of people are fighting for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they don't get the budget dollars to do the work, or their executive director doesn't support them, or the board doesn't support them. And they really need to get their minds wrapped around why it's important to actually build buy-in, because people are not bought in. And so that's why we have this why conversation. And I can't keep going. Like usually I can host like an hour-long conversation about the whys, but I'm going to keep moving forward. It seems like everyone's on the same page that this is important, and everyone hopefully is on the same page as to what diversity and equity and inclusion and everything mean. And so now I want to like shift gears, and I want to do an activity. I'm gonna read two scenarios to you all. I don't know if it's going to be really distracting to read the words on the screen while I talk. So you can also just close your eyes and listen to me talk, because I'll just be reading what's on the screen. And I just want you to picture it and don't overthink it. And they're going to be two different scenarios. Okay, so the first one is this one. So after scrubbing down, a surgeon walks into surgery. Oh, shoot. Sorry. I'd stopped. Okay, walks into surgery for a routine appendectomy. The surgeon greets the patient, and the surgical team tells the patient about the process of the surgery, and then instructs the anesthesiologist to begin the anesthesia process. A surgical nurse assists in the anesthesia process while another continues to organize the surgical instruments. And once the patient is fully under, the surgeon turns to one of the nurses and says, "Let's get started. Scalpel, please." So that's the first one. Everyone like have that picture in their heads? Anyone not ready for scenario 2? Okay, this one's like a little more relevant to the work you're doing. So the mountain bikers didn't realize when they started their nearly 2,000-mile journey from Missoula that they'd have to deal with hail and 8-foot snowdrifts. They were a self-sufficient unit, each biker carrying their own rations, cookware, tent, and other necessities. But after crossing the Yellowstone and the Little Bighorn rivers, they were tired and hungry and only halfway to St. Louis, where their mountain bike trek would end. And they still hadn't gotten to the grueling 200-mile trek through Nebraska's notorious sand hills. Everyone have that picture in their heads? Okay. So I'd like for you to have a short, like, we'll make this 5 minutes. I'm going to time it actually, or maybe less than, we'll make it 4 minutes discussion. Oh, I didn't ask all the questions here, but in your mental picture, what race was the surgeon? What race was the nurse? What gender was the nurse? What race were the mountain bikers? What gender were the mountain bikers? So those are just 2 of the questions I want to ask. I just forgot to include the others, but yeah, just think about like, what do these people look like in the picture that you had in your heads? And I'm going to forefront that with like, you're good people. I'm assuming you are all very good people. So don't feel like ashamed or bad about it, but just turn to the person next to you and talk about it.
Yeah. I definitely pictured him as a physiologist. I definitely didn't picture him. They were in great spirits, actually. There were definitely some rumors. There were definitely a bunch of dudes. That's for sure. What you do, yeah, a bunch of dudes. There was an Asian guy. Asian guy? A nurse? Wait, there was a nurse. Yeah. I don't know if I should. Most of the people in the story were white males. Yeah. That's good. No POCs. No, you don't like to see doctors.
It's grown slightly quiet out here.
What did you say? Are folks done talking?
I think so, yes.
Okay. So like what was Nick, if you were gonna like, were there any themes?
So there's definitely a theme of picturing the head surgeon or the doctor as a white male. A couple of people mentioned seeing the nurse that assisted the anesthesiologist as a female. There was some talk that in the mountain biking scenario, there was less of a overall theme of thinking about white males. There's a little more thought of people of different races in that situation than in the surgical one, it sounded like. Am I missing anything with someone like that? Yeah, it's kind of overwhelmingly a picture of white people.
Yeah. So, yeah, and then this is just a question about race and gender, and I know that like diversity is about a lot more than that, but I'm curious for people who did picture the surgeon as a man, or the surgeon as a white man, or the nurse as a woman, or the mountain bikers as a man. where does that picture come from? When I ask you to, like, I didn't put any gender or race in the scenarios, so you filled in the blanks. Where did that come from for you? What are some, like, yeah, how did you create that image?
Commercials, media, general culture, experience,
Yeah.
male-dominated industries.
Yeah. Yeah. So this does come from a particular place, right? It's not like you just came up with it out of the blue. Everyone has a lens, and you fill in the blanks, and that's totally natural. And if it's comes from your personal experience, and I'm guessing like Gunnison's not super racially diverse, like, so if it comes from like the pool of doctors or mountain bikers in the Gunnison area, or if it comes from statistics generally about surgeons, whom we know, I think there are more men than women. If it comes from like the mountain biking community, and we know that there's no underrepresentation of women and underrepresentation of people of color. If it comes from commercials, if it comes from TV shows like ER, or you don't watch ER, no one watches ER, Grey's Anatomy. Like, all that is like different sources of information that we have that help our brains make sense of the world around us. So, and that's okay. Like, this is like the reality of the way our brains work. So then my question is, what's the problem? If this just comes from your own experience, or like the media you let wash over you, why is it an issue for your mental image of a doctor to be a man, or a mountain biker to be a man, or a doctor to be white?
It affects the way we live.
How so?
If we're trying to go into an industry, it's something that's systemically, forgive me, an issue, and everything's whitewashed. And I would kind of agree with that. When you're looking at an industry, there's already an idea that someone may be ahead of you just because of how people typically view that industry.
Yeah, so I think you're like circling the plane, but I think if you landed the plane, ultimately, I think the industry continues to be predominantly white, in part because all of us individuals have, and it's not just white folks, but it's people of color too, who have these biases that are ingrained sometimes, that in our minds we picture like the normal rock climber to look a certain way, or the normal mountain biker to look a certain way, or like the outdoor guide or educator. And so when someone falls outside your mental picture of normal, you have this moment of cognitive dissonance and you don't know what to do about it. And sometimes what happens in that moment is you think that like that person's not a good fit. They're like, oh, they're not a good culture fit. And that happens in a lot of outdoor organizations, is that people don't get hired because they're not considered part of good culture fit. And when you actually drill down to what that is about, it's because they're just a little bit different. And they don't look like the archetype of a person who would work for, a particular outdoor company. And so it has real impacts, right? Our mental pictures, even if they're unconscious, continue to propagate a culture that's not very welcoming for a lot of people. Any other thoughts on these scenarios? I know that it was a little bit of a gotcha, but I run unconscious bias workshops, so like for a living. So like we have to do a few activities to get people to realize that we all have bias. Okay. Someone say something? Nick?
So the image of all the white people in those scenarios is the opposite of inclusion and what we're talking about.
Yeah. but it doesn't make you bad people. I think I think the crux of what we need to work on as individuals working in the outdoor rec and industry space is thinking about our own unconscious biases and who we think of when we think of a mountain biker or a climber or a good program participant. And I use the doctor scenario as sort of a lead in because it's pretty typical that industry is also quite male dominated. There was a situation on a Delta Airlines flight where there was a passenger a couple years ago, a passenger who needed care. And a black woman stood up. The flight attendant said, "We need a doctor." And a black woman stood up, and in that moment of cognitive dissonance, the flight attendant said, "Sit down, honey. We need a real doctor," because she was a black woman and she didn't meet the flight attendant's image in her head of what a doctor looked like. And so it has real impacts on people, and it also sends a message to like really young people of color, young women, about what they can and cannot do, right? You want to see one to be one. And if everyone's mental picture of a mountain biker, let's say, is a white man, what does that say to like a young girl of color who might be really excited about mountain biking, right? So we need to start unpacking our biases is really the bottom line. And also not feel guilty about it because there's a reason they exist. Like if you Google image surgeon, like this is the dude that shows up on like the first page. Like this is the stuff, it's like it comes from a particular place, right? And you know, if anyone's into mountain biking, like all of these people on the cover are white men, even if you can't really tell, of Mountain Bike Magazine. And so we have media and we have an industry that continues to tell us like what these people look like who should be engaging in very particular activities in particular places. And our job is to complicate that and to defy that. So the other story, the mountain bike story that I told you was actually about these people. And these were the Buffalo Soldiers, and they were an all-black infantry unit. And this was in the I need to I'm going to press escape to look at my notes because the notes are really more interesting. No, summer of 1897, these men made a nearly 2,000 mile journey on their bikes from Missoula to St. Louis. And the reason they did that is that the military was testing these Spalding bikes for military purposes. So they were reinforced, fitted with steel rims and puncture-proof tires and reinforced forks. And they were going through like off-trail travel for a lot of it. And each bike, for people who are like gearheads in this group, the bike weighed 32 pounds. So pretty heavy. And so when people think of mountain biking, and I spoke at the International Mountain Bike Association conference, people think of Marin County and they think of these guys who like would scream down Mount Tam on their bikes. And the reality is in the 1800s, these were the people who were really mountain biking, right? This is them as well. And this is them in Thermopolis, Wyoming, close to where I am. They carried everything on them. I'm like reading my notes here. They spent 40 days going through the Rockies. They averaged 6.3 miles per hour, and they went more than 50 miles each day on mountain bikes, which is pretty impressive. And these are the stories that are not told. And because these stories are not told, we have a very particular image of what a mountain biker looks like. And you can fill in those blanks about anything, right? You can fill in those blanks about climber, backpacker, canoeist, anyway, person who is on water. I'm not a water person. I'm a mountain person. So these are the stories that really do need to be told. So folks talked about underrepresentation. This is like an interesting data of like who's represented in the mountain bike industry. And it's just mountain biking, but it's sort of very similar in a lot of other outdoor sectors. So each of these bikes represents like membership, right? Women are a minority, as are people who are non-white, as are people who have no degree. And I think that the biggest thing is the class barriers to engaging in mountain biking. And as you all like start thinking more and more about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'd urge you to think about class, especially in this political climate. It's really important to not just talk about race and racism, but classism, because I think the outdoor rec space and as well as conservation has really left low-income folks and poor folks really behind. And is not providing ways for them to engage in some of these activities. So yeah, so like make less than 60,000, that bottom thing. So there was, most people actually made more than 100,000 a year in IMBA, most of the members, which is really interesting data wise, if people like to geek out on data. So what we've just been talking about is the fact that we all have these unconscious biases. And that's what's creating an industry that's not really inclusive of people of multiple identities. If you wanted a definition, I can provide it for you, but I'm going to start with just like how it works is that every moment we receive a ton of information, 11 billion bits of it, but we can only process 40. And so 99.99996% of what we process is unconscious. And how that works is, and it's part of the way that we survived as a species, is that we would see a tiger and we see that a tiger is a predator, and then these connectivities happen between neurons in our brain that allow us to more quickly process it next time, so that we don't have to think about it. We don't have to be conscious about it. Because if we saw this tiger that's hiding in the grass in this particular image, and we were like, oh, is that an animal? I don't know. Let me see if it has 4 legs. Let me get closer. We would have been lunch. We would not have survived as a species. And so this mental process of unconscious bias was a survival mechanism. But then now that we live in like comfortable places and sitting in rooms and working in like pretty like life or death is not a question for us on a daily basis for many of us. We still have a brain that works in the same way. And because of that, we make decisions like on hiring or on like who's a good participant or who would make a great culture fit for our organization based on this mechanism that is part of our biology. And so we need to be able to realize it's happening and figure out how we actually counteract it. So unconscious bias is unconscious, subtle, involuntary assumptions or judgments that we make every day based on our previous experiences and culture. It's the lens that we walk through the world with. I want to just talk about a couple of, and we're going to do a little activity here in a second again, about how this shows up in outdoor rec. The first one is like stereotypes. And we define stereotypes as widely held but oversimplified ideas about a person based on their identities. And we put real or perceived because you can perceive someone's identity, but you may be wrong. So you may think someone's a particular gender, let's say, and that may not be true, but you may still have stereotypes about them. So let me ask you all, are there stereotypes that you've heard of or that exist that either in your program about outdoor rec? Yeah, I'm curious. What are some stereotypes that you want to share?
Really, I would say anything that has influenced you, any stereotype that has influenced you. Recreation, there are a lot of stereotypes, but if it's not necessarily focused just towards recreation, I think you could still definitely share it.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily. I was trying to bring it back home to recreation, but it could be any stereotype that has impacted you or that you've heard. Like, what are some examples?
Latinos work hardest.
Mm-hmm.
The girls want help with beta when they're climbing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've heard that rec majors are bad at math. Can't necessarily disagree personally, but it's still a stereotype.
Trying to get car insurance right now, and anytime I drop the fact that I'm a college student, it immediately like jacks up my credit.
Oops. Yeah. So let's think about I think we're really going to like a broad world of assumptions here, right? But let's think about identities, like going back to our definition of diversity, like identities based on which you may experience advantages or barriers. So like based on gender identity, sexual orientation, race, class, ability, age, I guess college student is it is age based actually. That's a pretty legit stereotype that people have, is that college students are not responsible, and that's what jacks up insurance rates. Yeah. Any other stereotypes?
You hit like a girl.
Yeah.
I would relate that one to outdoor recreation. A lot of people think that women might not be as strong climbers,
Hmm.
even though I know a lot of women that can outclimb me.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole like a girl thing, or like you're burly for a girl. Yeah, those are all like those they come from their statements and behaviors that come from like fundamental stereotypes people hold. So, what are stereotypes? I have an example here actually that I wanted to share, but may or may not show up. There's this PBS series called Black Folk Don't, and I think it's like a really fascinating series. It's created by folks who identify as Black, and it explores over a number of different episodes a range of stereotypes about the Black community. And each one's different. So this episode is Black folk don't camp. And then there's Black folk don't do winter sports. Black folk don't swim. There's a bunch of other non-outdoor stuff too. And they're each like 7 to 10 minutes long. And what happens is that in the series, which I would urge you to watch, it's free online on PBS, is they interview different people who identify as Black or African American, and they ask, like, what do you think of this? And some people say, yeah, I don't camp because I'm not interested. Other people say, I don't camp because there is historical trauma that's happened to the Black community in these places, in the woods, and I was always told not to go into the woods. Uh, Other folks say, I don't camp because there are barriers for me. I don't have the equipment, or I don't have the skills. And so what the series does is shows you that like there is no one story. And there's another Black person that says, I actually do camp. And like no one says that, no one talks about the fact that actually there are Black folk who do camp. So the episode, we talk about like complicating the stereotype, this idea of like teasing apart this oversimplification about a particular community, and realizing that there's no monolithic community. Like the Black community is not a monolith, the Indian community is not a monolith, and we're all very different from each other and have different experiences. And so that's like one way to think about how to like fight those stereotypes, because those stereotypes feed into your biases. And there's gender-based stereotypes, there's class-based stereotypes, there's so much out there. I have some examples of stereotypes, but before I do that, I want to talk about stereotypes versus norms, because people get a little bit confused. So before I do that, actually, before you stare at this table, so I was in Keystone, Colorado a couple years ago, and there's this thing called this Colorado Statewide Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Report, SCORP. I don't know if that's the acronym. It's SCORP, but the state of Colorado does like an analysis of like how people are recreating, and so in that analysis, a couple of years ago, they talked about the Latinx community in the Front Range, and they said the community generally travels further to recreate. They recreate in larger groups of up to like 99 people at a time, which actually I resonate with given my background. They'll stay longer at a particular site. So if you have like a picnic site, there's not like a lot of turnover. And so this information was like really built to like help agencies better manage different areas. And there's a difference between that and just saying that like Latino people don't care about the environment, which is a stereotype. Because that information in the SCORP report is what I would call a norm. So stereotypes are generally negative. They're based on assumptions and opinions and limited information and misinformation. They're not helpful. They don't guide you in positive outcomes. They're qualified usually by like all Latino people, always. Like I've heard this on Noel's courses of like, oh, you have a Latino student. Latino students are always homesick, or they usually have never been away from home before. Those are stereotypes, and they're sweeping, they're simple. Norms, on the other hand, like what I mentioned about the SCORP report, is not always negative. It's based on like observable, repeated behavior research. It's helpful. It's intended to guide outcomes. And usually it's qualified. It has like the words often or sometimes, like, like the Latino community often picnics in larger groups. And it's complex and it's nuanced. And so those are the differences. And so I think that as you think about like things that are said to you about particular people or communities, try to like put it in a bucket of like, is this a norm? Where's that coming from? Is it research? Or is this person just saying this because it's a stereotype? Because there's a danger of a single story. And this is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who wrote Americana. And she says, when a particular story about a group of people is told over and over again, it becomes our single story. It becomes a stereotype that, although may be true for some, is incomplete because it's not true for all. And power is really the ability to tell that the story of another person, not just the ability to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that other person. And so I think a lot of our job of creating inclusive environments in outdoor rec is to make sure that we're not telling single stories. And so I have an example here. And has anyone read Rahawa Haile? She was in Outside Magazine. She was interviewed on the She Explores podcast. She's a Black woman who hiked the Appalachian Trail a couple years ago. And it's called How Black Books Lit My Way Along the Appalachian Trail. So she said, the Appalachian Trail, is without a question the kindest, most welcoming, least aggressively homogenous space I'm likely to encounter in America in the next 4 years. So let's say like that is the story that Rahawa, who is like clearly a Black woman, wrote, and it's like published everywhere. It's been picked up by multiple outlets. I think even Backpacker Magazine, Outside Magazine, all these podcasts. She's even writing a book. If that was the single story, then like it's really tempting to be like, we've done it. Public lands are super inclusive. She had a great experience. Look at what she said. And the reality is that the very same year that she went out on the AT, this other woman, Minda Honey, went out to different national parks on her own journey, and she also identifies as Black. And her experience was quite the opposite. She said she had hit the road and search for something of myself in nature, and instead I'd stumbled upon the equivalent of arriving at Walden Pond and being greeted by a whites only sign posted to a stake driven into the ground on its banks. So like clearly a very different experience. And the lesson here is that it's really important for us to not take any one person's experience as like the experience of their whole community, and to continue to unpack that and continue to find out, oh, Aparna, she's like Indian and this is her experience in national parks. Chances are another Indian person is not going to have had the same exact experience. And to tell those stories. And that really helps us like be able to, going back to those scenarios of the mountain bikers, not fill in the blanks with the sort of dominant identities that typically exist. Anyone have any questions? I feel like I've been talking at you for a little bit. We have like a little less than half an hour of me talking at you. I'll open it up for questions.
I really like it. I guess I never really thought about that, but it definitely resonated with that. So I might have done that again.
He said that he thought it was really interesting how you brought up the danger of a single story, and that he hadn't thought about that in the past.
Yeah, I mean, so, there are a lot of people of color who have been in this industry for a while who get constantly called upon to like serve on panels at conferences or speak at different universities about their story. And I think the danger is, and I think it's really important for folks to talk about their own story, but then people take that as like the story. Like, okay, Jose Gonzalez, Latino Outdoors, he came here, he talked about his experience. That is a Latino experience. And now I can like, all my actions are going to be guided by Jose's story. But there's like such a myriad multitude of Latino experiences or Latinx experiences in nature. And it's important for us to like find them out. And just like ask people like, what's your experience or what's your connection to nature? What's your connection to the outdoors? And they'll be like, I bet you find out some really interesting things. So yeah. Any other questions?
I would ask how you, what you think is the best way to spread different stories and get those different perspectives and experiences in the outdoors.
Yeah, I'm gonna get to that. That's like the end. The end of the presentation is like, what do I do with all of this? So like if you're like slumping in your seat, like, oh my gosh, I have bias, and I think of single stories. Like, don't worry. There's like tools at the end. I will talk about a little bit. So if we can like bookmark that, that'd be great.
We can definitely bookmark that.
Cool.
Any other questions?
Okay, so I just wanted to talk. These are some of the things we've heard, stereotypes we've heard from our clients. And so I just wanted to step through them. If I had more time with you, I'd actually get you into groups and you'd look at each one and you'd be like, oh, what does it mean? What's implied? What's the impact? So the first one of like, let's get the Latino community involved in preservation or conservation. So I think there is an assumption that people of color actually don't care about outdoor spaces. And a lot of folks feel like, oh, we need to get them out there. So they start caring. And the reality is that there's research that shows that people of color do care about nature and they care about the outdoors. And the way they care about it just looks different. And so this first one is like a stereotype that like, oh, Latino community doesn't care. The second one is, oh, wow, you're a runner, to someone who has like a disability. Actually, the very specific example, there's a woman named Myrna Valario who is an REI sponsored ultra runner, and she's a Black woman and she's body positive, and the amount of negative comments she gets about being a runner or like not really being a runner because of her body size is pretty, I don't know how she does it, but other videos of her, you can Google Myrna Valario, but I'm sure, I mean, I've experienced this. I'm a climber and I also hunt. I get asked like, you're a hunter? What? Like that moment of cognitive dissonance of like, brown woman hunting, I don't get this. I'm very confused. Is really based on a stereotype of like what you imagine a hunter looks like or what you imagine a climber looks like. The third one is like, we support grants to get youth of color to explore the outdoors so they'll start caring about our environment. Again, I think there's an assumption that people of color don't care, which is not true. It just doesn't look the same way that, I think we feel like if they cared, they would be doing exactly what we're doing. Like, why aren't they rock climbing? Why aren't they skiing? But if you start delving a little bit deeper, you'll realize that like the environmental connection for some people is very different than ours. And it doesn't always like resonate for someone to do rock climbing or skiing or kayaking. The fourth one is there's a marketing this is like really like the Nike thing, right? Just do it. So a marketing campaign that says like, just get outside, just do it. What are you waiting for? And this is like subtle, but the stereotype there is like just the assumption that all of us don't experience barriers, that like it's a choice. If we're not getting outside, then it's our choice, and that we're not prioritizing it, which is why we don't get outside. And the reality is we know that there are barriers, and I'll talk about those toward the end, and that it's not easy for everyone to just get outside. The second to last one is to someone who is Black, like, how do we get more Black folks interested in climbing? And I'm sure you've heard this before too. Again, going back to the single story, like one Black person doesn't represent a whole race of people. And it can feel like really tokenizing to that person to be enlisted to like educate someone. The last one is like the one that's kind of a kicker for people, which is, and it happens a lot, of like Native American folklore tells us that this place is sacred and healing, and we have an obligation to protect it. And there's a proverb, the Native American proverb, that says, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And there's like a lot of different layers of stereotyping there. There's one layer is there's an assumption that Native Americans are like one big monolithic community, and there's a ton of diversity in Indigenous and Native American tribes. The second one is like just not being precise and saying like Native American folklore instead of like instead of saying this comes from like the Cheyenne tribe or the Shoshone tribe. There's also this sort of exoticization of Native Americans that often happens where they're like portrayed as the quote unquote noble savage, and that borrowing from some of their spirituality is like something we need to do if we're going to want to get closer to the earth. Another layer of this is like just the fact that a lot of times we think of we relegate Native American culture to the past and don't realize that it currently exists, and that there are Indigenous and Native American people here today. There's like so much wrong with that last one, and that's something that like is happening. The big trend in the outdoor industry is remembering that all of our public lands were created by dispossessing Indigenous and Native American people of their land. And that today, when we talk about public lands belonging to all of us, oftentimes we don't think about the real history. And it's not a savory, it's very unsavory history, and we have to own it. So these are just some examples of stereotypes. I just wanted to put them out there because we hear this. All of this, we hear a lot in the organizations that we work with. Anyone have any questions on this one? Or other stereotypes you want to add to this? Just jog your memory. Oh, I have this implication/impact as well, which I'm not going to go through because I just did.
I think we're good right now.
Okay. So I want to like just tell you some data because I think it's important if you're going to like be in this space for a little bit of time, that like all these biases that we have consequences. And it's not just like anecdotal stories of different people who are like, oh, this place is not for me because it's not welcoming. There's like data that shows why it's not. And so the Outdoor Industry Association has an annual report on outdoor participation that you may or may not have as like part of the work that you all do or in your program. Sorry, I have to like move the sidebar here. Let me go back. My face is blocking the data. I can't handle this. So if you look at the highlights by demographics, so this is ages 6+. It's interesting to see, at least in the ethnicity bar, which is the one on the very far right, that 73% of people who participate in outdoor recreation, which is defined by the outdoor industry as like very specific things. I will tell you, it's like you're either climbing or running or biking or backpacking. So like going to a picnic in the park or like playing soccer in your green space or fishing in your like neighborhood like creek is not part of what the Outdoor Industry Association considers as recreation. But even with what they consider as recreation, you can see that there is still a minority of participation by people of color. And so like I think that's pretty obvious. But if you actually dive into the data, it's super interesting to see what it means. So this graph shows you participation rates among different groups. And the bottom line, sorry, it's going to like click out here for a second because, okay. So it's interesting to see even within groups of color, how different it is. So like the top line, the yellow line is people who identify as white. The red is Asian, the blue is Hispanic, and the green is Black. And I think this is interesting just to show that like people say like, oh, people of color as like a big like catch-all term. But the reality is that even within communities of color, it's very different. I, as like a South Asian immigrant, have very different barriers than someone who identifies as Black. And so you can see that the Black community at least has the lowest participation rates in the activities that the Outdoor Industry Association defines as recreation. But if you actually look at the number of, this is like our pet peeve thing. We crossed out diverse and said racial/ethnic because it was used as code in the report. Sorry, this is our little, okay, we'll ignore that. If you actually look at the number of outings per participant though, it's really interesting because Black and Hispanic participants actually went on more outings, like 88 outdoor outings, which is 11 more per year than their white counterparts. And so what this tells us is that we as in outdoor recreation have a very narrow view of what is like legit outdoor activities. But if you just define it as outings, it looks really different. And then we look at like, what are our people actually doing? And this is super interesting too. So people who identify as white, the top activity, which actually is a little bit surprising to me, I don't know if it's surprising to you, is fly fishing or fishing, at least last year, 2017. But if you look at the other communities, Black, Hispanic, and Asian, it's running, jogging, and trail running. That's the top activity. So this lesson really is about, if you're trying to think about bringing more people into spaces that you value and care about, like what are the activities you could engage in that are culturally relevant? And maybe it's not like car camping, and maybe it's not fly fishing, and maybe it's not rock climbing or hiking. Maybe it's just going on a run or jog or walk or trail running. Because the reasons that people of color get outside, for the most part, if you look at it, is to get exercise and to be with family and friends. And that's something that's shared in like all demographics. And then the second reason that's unique to people of color, which is the bottom circle, is that to get physically fit. So if you think about like outdoor spaces as these like really transcendental, amazing places to just be and connect with nature, that's not going to connect. That's not going to be a reason that a lot of people of color are out there. The reason that a lot of people of color are out there is about their bodies. It's about their health. It's about their well-being. It's about their fitness. And then the barriers. So these are the barriers, and this is really interesting as well. So what are the top barriers to people going outside? If you look at within the Black, Hispanic, and Asian communities, family responsibilities is a big barrier. The price of outdoor rec equipment, not having people to go with, right? That's a huge thing. Not feeling intimidated by the skills or abilities that it takes to do some of these things. And then if you look at the bottom three circles, it's not having enough information, and also just being too busy doing other recreational activities that are more accessible. So this is all just really important information because it helps us figure out how to dismantle those barriers, right? How do we make out, if people are saying they're too busy with family responsibilities, how do we surmount that barrier? Well, maybe we run family programming. If people are saying, oh, outdoor rec equipment is too expensive, how do we dismantle that barrier? Maybe we say, okay, let's create a gear library that people can borrow tents, people can borrow sleeping bags. If the barrier is I don't have anyone else to go with, maybe you create a online community where people can connect with each other. If the barrier is I don't have enough skills, maybe you create a program where you have camping 101, how to set up a tent, how to create a fire, how to adjust your backpack, like those basic things. Those are just things to be thinking about if you're wanting to bring more people in from different, at least racial or ethnic backgrounds. I wanted to give a little shout out to gender here because we've been talking about race, but it's super interesting that gender is, people think that we're past talking about gender, and that's not true. Also that more and more people are identifying outside the gender binary. And so this research was done about products that people buy. And I think it's interesting because it could also relate to sort of, if you're for example, you're in a program where you have to outfit someone with clothing or with jackets or with shoes or whatever. The reality is that a very small percentage so Generation Z is the pink line, and that's people from ages 13 to 20. The millennials is the blue, which is people ages 21 to 34. And I think that you all probably are in these buckets of age groups, or at least the blue one or the pink one, maybe, if you're undergrads. That folks in your age range don't really buy products that are actually gendered, that align with their own gender. specifically with sports equipment, specifically with clothes. And so that's just something to think about. If so an example I can tell you is that at Knowles, at least, there'll be a group of students that come in, and then the the students that the instructors perceive to be girls will be taken over to like a rack that has these like pink and purple like puffy jackets. Uh, and so like how do you like interrupt that in the moment? Well, the reality is like people have different like tastes in what they want to wear and different body sizes, and it should not be related to their gender. So that was just another thing that I thought was interesting with data. I think that's the last piece of data I wanted to talk about. And then I wanted to end with some like tips and tools for you all. But do you have any questions on the data?
Um, I don't own the data. I definitely do, but I'm gonna save it for after you give the tips and tools because you might cover it.
Okay. So, this is just like this is a window into like a day-long workshop that we run with people on unconscious bias. So we can't dive too deeply into all of this, but I'm trying to figure out, like, if I were talking to you as outdoor rec majors, what are some things you could do to make the outdoor rec community more inclusive, to interrupt your own biases, um, and to honor all these different ways that people with different identities could connect with the outdoors. And so the first thing is just to be able to have hard conversations. And I think that we are in a space where like it's pretty easy to want to stay in our comfort zone and not be uncomfortable and not have hard conversations. And I would urge you all to do that. I mean, next time, for example, I've had so many experiences where I'm climbing with my partner who is male, and he gets asked for the beta on a climb versus me, which is a huge assumption about like who led the climb. Um, Actually thinking about like calling that out in the moment, being like, hey, instead of just letting it slide. Because every time we let those little things slide, that's when it just all piles up. If there's a tiny, like, hey, you're really burly for a woman, being like, I appreciate that, but like, it shouldn't matter that I'm a woman. That being qualified as a woman actually makes it seem like I shouldn't be burly. Um, so being able to have those conversations and really talk about the impacts of particular behaviors on you. And there's like I'm sure you all talk about feedback in I'm assuming there's like a whole class on communication and feedback and leadership and all that stuff. Is that right? Yeah. So just like remember to use those tools and use them with these when people's stereotypes start coming out in their statements and their behaviors. So that's like your individual thing you can do. Another thing you can do is just learn about and then honor how people connect to and care for land and water and wildlife. So we have an assumption of like the way to connect with the outdoors is to go out on like in a small group with backpacks in remote wilderness. And we know that like people actually have many more connections than that with the outdoors. There are people like me who connected with the outdoors through community and through family. So like being in a large group and being loud and being rambunctious is like important to me in order to connect. Um, Other people connect to nature through hunting or through foraging or through gardening or growing. Um, and other people connect through nature through spirituality or cultural practice. There's so many different, and then yet other people connect to the outdoors through the fact that nature has not been good to them. So environmental justice is a really important thing to think about, because if you ask someone, particularly poor folks in rural area, I mean, poor rural and as well as poor urban folks, like what's your connection to nature? A lot of times it's like, my water's bad, I can't drink my water. I live near a dump, and like there's so many different environmental justice issues that impact people. And so they don't necessarily have really good connections with nature. In LA, for example, Mark Magana, who's head of Green Latinos, said that his connection to nature was like not going outside because he had asthma, and like the amount of smog in the air in LA was always too much for him to go outside. So those are all different ways people connect. The very particular story I have is Devil's Tower here, which is also Matotapila in originally Matotapila, which is a very spiritual place for a number of tribes in the area of Wyoming. And Devil's Tower has been like a very controversial location. It's the first national monument in the U.S. The sign says, "Please don't disturb prayer bundles and prayer cloths," because it's also culturally and spiritually significant for a number of tribes in the area. And you might also know that it's a climbing destination. And so there's been an ongoing sort of the battle, for lack of a better term, at Devil's Tower because there's just like been a lack of respect and honoring of indigenous connections. So there was a big lawsuit, and the Native American tribes lost. But basically, they were asking for people not to climb because it was sacrilegious. And all they got out of it was a voluntary 1 month ban on climbing in the middle of the summer during a very particular month that was particularly like important in their culture. And that's the month where people could opt not to climb. Now, the irony, that's a falcon. There is a period of time where it is a mandatory ban on Devil's Tower not to climb because of nesting falcons. Mandatory for the falcons, voluntary for the indigenous tribes. I bring up this example because it shows us like what we value and how we value it in outdoor recreation, and that we think of falcons as more valuable sometimes than people. So the lesson here is just, again, learning about and honoring and valuing all the different ways people connect to these places that we value, and not assuming that they're going to get the same thing out of it that we do. So that's like one of the, so like, how do you learn about these things? There's a bunch of information online. There's a bunch of information on our website, on our resources page. There are a lot of stories that have been hidden. There are a lot of stories that are not told, but they're more and more, they are being told. So one thing you can do is when you start like lionizing these people, like, I think this is Warren Miller. Oh gosh, I should actually look at my notes here. Yeah, Warren Miller, going back, sorry. I wanted to show some examples of heroes in outdoor rec. Warren Miller, Frank Sanders, so he's the guy on Devil's Tower who's been climbing it every day. Edward Abbey, John Muir, Fred Beckey, who just died. These are some like huge heroes in the world of outdoor recreation. They're all white men. Not all of them are around. And their stories are told as like these, maybe with the exception of a couple of them, but this idea of like people we need to look up to. And the reality is they were not categorically benevolent people. A lot of them had very troubling views on women. Warren Miller and Fred Beckey were not particularly, they were like pretty sexist people. Edward Abbey has said some pretty negative things about immigrants and about Native Americans. John Muir said terrible things about Native Americans. And Frank Sanders has been fighting to continue keeping Devil's Tower open for rock climbing and wanting to discount Native American needs. So they're complex people. They're all like product of their time, but it's important for us to be able to tell the complex stories of who they are and not just tell the story of like them as like the person or the hero. And then the other thing to talk about is there are also untold stories. So this is Charlie Crenshaw, who was the first Black man to climb Denali. His story was not told. This is Tenzing Norgay, but like it's really important to think about Sherpas outside of the fact they're almost talked about as a profession and not an ethnicity, and their achievements are not usually recognized. These are two Awanichi women in Yosemite National Park, which was created after it was dispossessed from the Awanichi people. So there was the Mariposa Battalion that burned down their village and then made them leave. and the only conditions under which they were allowed to stay is if they performed basket weaving for tourists. That's a story that doesn't get told. This story, Black Walden, we think of Henry David Thoreau as like our hero who like thought living alone and on a pond. Well, guess what? There was a freed slave named Zilpah White who also lived on that pond and whom he looked up to and who had lived there for longer than he had. Her story is not told. These are the stories that we need to start telling more so that we can balance out the stories that have always been told. And then there's current stories. This is like all new people. There's a whole platform called Diversify Outdoors. And these are all people that are leveraging social media to tell the complex and diverse stories of people's connections to the outdoors. And it's a super easy way for you all to start. Like the very first thing you can do if you have like an Instagram account, which I'm assuming everyone does these days. If you have an Instagram account or Facebook or Twitter, all these people are on there, and that can help you learn about different connections. And this is just a sampling of people who are on that in that group. And yeah, they continue to like complicate the stereotype of like who's out there and what they're doing and why they're doing it. So that's my last slide, as you can tell. Those are just some things you all can do to sort of change the narrative, change the culture of the outdoor rec space. There's much more, but like, you know, in an hour and a half, I didn't want to like, we don't have time to talk about all the things. But yeah, let me just stop there. Thank you all for like continuing to, I can't really tell if you're listening or if you're sleeping or if you're checking your iPhones, but I'm assuming you're listening. So yeah, I want to just open it up for questions and then get you out of here so you can go hang out. It still looks like it's light out there, so.
If it's very long, you can also. Okay. I'm just gonna butcher your question.
I'm just gonna come out here. So you were talking about using equity as a way to like be more inclusive. Now, I've got a job where I'm an outdoor educator, and if there's like, how do I do that without seeming like patronizing to the participant? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really important to just, well, okay, there are a couple of things there. So as an outdoor educator, equity can look like a lot of things. I think that like everyone who's done like an outdoor ed program knows that like not all your participants are going to take the same amount of energy, right? You spend a lot more energy on one person who needs that support. So that's equity. How you distribute like backpack weight is equity. And I think that the way to not make that person feel patronized is instead of assuming what they need, is to just ask. I think that like people don't ask, and not making any assumptions. Just say like, how can I better support you as your course leader or your instructor? What do you need, and how can I support you? And give them that space to be able to articulate their needs. And I think that once they tell you their needs and you can actually support them, then it's no longer patronizing. I think it's patronizing if you're like, oh, you know, you're Latino, so you must be really homesick, and I'm going to spend extra time with you so we can talk about your family. Is that okay? That's a pretty extreme example, but I just want to, yeah. Other questions?
So I feel like you've talked a lot on the importance of hearing different perspectives and hearing these different stories of people's experiences in the outdoors. But I know that to some, if not a lot of people that we're trying to engage in the outdoors, they have the same preconceived notions of the outdoor industry that some of us might, and it might be intimidating to them to enter into a situation that they feel uncomfortable with. Mm-hmm. Besides sharing those different stories and understanding those perspectives, what would you say is a good way to help them overcome that insecurity or fear of venturing out into something that they might think they won't be welcomed into?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think first of all, like it's totally okay for a person to be like, this is just not my jam. I don't want to be like the one chocolate chip in the cookie, and I don't want to do this. I don't feel welcome, and I'm not going to be part of this space. And I think just saying like that's fine and that's okay, and not being like no, 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 but we're really good people. And I think for some people it's just not their thing. Um, the second thing I will say is that I think it's really important for people to be able to connect. And so one of the things I'm also founder of this summit called People of the Global Majority in the Outdoors, Nature, and the Environment. It's called PGM1. And it's happening in Oakland. It's the second year. And it brings together people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color who work in the outdoor space together in one space. Because every other conference we go to, we're like, we're in the minority, right? And we have to code switch or assimilate or not show up as fully ourselves. And so this space is created for them to find that mentorship, to network with each other, to keep inspired and to keep motivated. And so I would say like a lesson there, and you don't have to like send everyone to PGM1, but I think that being able to introduce people to others who have their same identities can really help. I think people, if they can network, and like here in Lander, Wyoming, we have a bunch of fellows who work at Knowles, and most of them are people of color. And I host gatherings in my house so we can all get together, and they could be like, can I tell you what happened to me on Main Street today? And they'd have to like process through that. It's really helpful. I think it's really helpful for people to be able to have that that venue of connection. Those are just a couple of things. And then like continuing to also just wanting to change the culture yourself, right? As someone who has that power to be able to do it, working on your people, whatever that might be, whether you're a man and you want to try to like work with other men on like trying to dismantle toxic masculinity, or if you're trying to like dismantle like cis sexism, which is like this idea like that everyone's gender identity needs to be like either male or female, like just working on all of that and then continuing to support people. I'm rambling now. I'm going to stop.
Any other questions? No? All right. Well, thank you so much, Aparna, for being with us today.
Yeah, so I'll send you this PowerPoint, Nick, but like this website, if you're like, I don't even know how to learn about these stories or these people, you can follow us on Twitter and we're always sharing stuff, but you can go to our resources page and there's a lot out there. There's like really interesting books and articles that, like Black Walden is one of them. There's like a whole book on like Chinese who worked in the logging industry in the West, and you're like, what? I didn't even know about this. So it's just like great if you're wanting to learn. If you're not wanting to just keep reading Edward Abbey and John Muir, and then these are the places you would go.
And if anyone's interested in getting this PowerPoint or more information on it, just see me afterwards. I'll get your contact info. All right. Well,
thanks for hanging in there with me for an indoor talk on a beautiful day. We all have time to get outside, enjoy the full moon, and email me if you have any questions. Great. Thanks. Nick, can I shut down, or do you want to talk about anything?
Yeah, you can go ahead and shut down.
Okay, I'll send you the recording and I'll send you a link to these slides. Thanks, everyone. Bye.